Well, thank you everybody for inviting me. It's great to be here. Super excited to come to the Art Students League. So much wonderful history and wonderful legacy. We were talking about it a little bit before, so it's absolutely an honor for me to be here speaking to you today. And I appreciate you guys coming out this evening to hear me talk about oil paint. The presentation I'm going to give today is called The Alchemy of Oils, Transformation of Matter. And I've made it fairly broad, so I'm hoping that it will speak to both the person who's been oil painting for many years, as well as those who are just being introduced to the material. So for those of you who know a lot, and there are probably some folks who know more than I do about things, please, I hope that there is something here that will at least pique your curiosity and give you a new tidbit of information as well. So with that, I want to talk about why I've titled it The Alchemy of Oils. I find that there is a lot of similarity, especially about people's perception of oil painting, that there's this great mystery that's happening behind closed doors, that you have to belong to some secret society and know all these secret recipes that only a few, and so that same kind of mythology is around oil paints. For me, the more truth of it is this idea of transformation of matter, which is at the heart of medieval alchemy, that early precursor to chemistry, and very much for me at the heart of painting, and especially oil painting, this idea of taking this material and transforming it into something else that communicates to each of us about the human experience. So that is why I like to use this reference to alchemy in terms of oil painting. And I love this picture because it says another thing about oil painters and alchemists. This was a painting from the 17th century, and there are many of this era from Northern Europe where you'll see this alchemist sitting in the studio with something exploding and something going awry. And in the background is the wife or spouse with the babies crying, or sometimes there's a bill collector hovering over her while the alchemist is busy at work. And that stereotype of alchemy and the moral lesson that was being taught has often been projected on artists and painters of that same period. And some of that still is with us today. So there's this kind of intertwining of our histories in terms of our identities as well. So a little bit about Royal Talens before I jump into talking about oils. Some of you may know about Royal Talens. Royal Talens is a Dutch manufacturer that was established in 1899. This is the original Royal Talens building. We are still located on that same piece of real estate established in 1899 as the Talens ink and lacquer factory. One of our first product lines, or some of our first product lines, included Rembrandt oils and Rembrandt watercolors. So they're kind of our legacy product line. This is a picture of the milling floor in the 1930s. We were still using the steam-powered paint mills. Has anybody seen a paint mill in action, or a photograph or a video of it? I've got a couple pictures later on of the newer versions. A totally different experience than what you see here. Some of the basic elements of the rollers, or the triple roll mill, are in function, but this idea that everything's running off of steam was something very much of this era. And what you can't see in this picture that I really enjoy in some of the other archival pictures is a lot of the people who are working on the floor are actually still wearing wooden shoes, wooden Dutch shoes. One of our first product lines, as I mentioned, were Rembrandt oils, Rembrandt watercolors that came out. There's a wonderful image that I typically share out of our catalog, which is an illustration of the watercolor set. I dug up this image of one of the first batches of tubes. If you ever get a chance to go to Apeldoorn, which is where we're located, about an hour east of Amsterdam by train, we actually have a building called the Experience Center. And in there we carry all of our products, and you can go in and pick anything off the shelf and work with it, and there are experts who are there can talk about materials. But there's also this wonderful museum of materials that date back to our origins and each generation, and a lot of the marketing materials that went with it. And so this is an image from those archives of those early generations of paints. Along with Rembrandt oils, watercolors, pastels, we also manufacture Van Gogh oils, pastels, and watercolor. Amsterdam is our acrylic line. Brunzil Pensos, Ecolina, liquid watercolor, and the list goes on. So Royal Talens is the parent company of all of those brands, if you will. And of course, then the next question is, how did you go from talents to being Royal Talens? And this individual is responsible for that. This is Queen Wilhelmina. And in 1945, she bestowed upon us our royal predicate. And so we became the paint makers to the Queen at that time. It was for our cultural and economic contributions to the Netherlands, and we still honor that today. Another inside note on that, the summer palace for the Dutch royal family is also located in Apeldoorn, and she was a painting enthusiast herself, so there was kind of a close relationship, walking distance really from the palace to where we were manufacturing the paint, or where we are manufacturing the paint today. And then finally, Royal Talens North America. So our products have been in North America since the 1930s. Painters like Hopper were big advocates of Rembrandt. If you look at some of his notebooks, he lists off the Royal Talens colors that he was working with. So the paint has been here for many years, but we were always distributing through a third party. So in 2015, we established Royal Talens North America, and we have a distribution center and customer service center now in Northampton, Massachusetts. So a stone's throw from here, and we're servicing the US and Canada. Mexico is part of North America, obviously, but they are serviced by a distributor that comes out of Central and South America. So we focus primarily on the US and Canada. All right, a little bit about myself. I am a painter for 30 plus years now. I taught university, studio art, and art history for a decade, and I've been in the art materials industry now for more than 20 years. My experience is pretty broad, everything from the retail, working in the stores, to manufacturing, but my passion has always been education. And I was, as I said, a university instructor in studio art, so that kind of has carried through my philosophy, my workings in the art materials industry as well. All right, so today's agenda, we're going to have a very, very brief history of oils. I always like to give some context to where the materials originate, what they're made of. I think having that relationship and knowledge enriches our experience with the materials and helps inform our practice as well. The more you know about where it came from and the stories behind it, always going to bring things to life in a different way. So I'm going to share a little bit about the history. Then I'm going to talk about the composition. What is oil paint itself? Then I'm going to talk about grounds, super important when you're thinking about oil paint and working with oil paint, the surface that you work on. I'll probably mention this again in the talk, but most of the questions or concerns or problems that oil painters have in their work, when it gets to me, I most always, I would say 80% of the time, can be taken back down to ground preparation. So there was a problem in the ground preparation, uneven or uneven gessoing or priming of the surface, resulting in sinking color, cracking, wrinkles, all sorts of problems that arise in oil painting later on began with the foundation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about pigments briefly. Pigments are such a fun and rich history to share. So I got a couple good stories about some pigments. Some you may be familiar with, others might be new colors to you. Then I'm going to talk about the binder. And this is really important because it's the binder that gives every medium its working properties. So the binder for oil paint, of course, is linseed oil. The binder for acrylic is an acrylic polymer resin, watercolor, gum arabic. The pigments are universal. It's the binder that gives each one of those materials its unique working properties. And then the binders, of course, for oil paints are the drying oils. So I'll describe not only linseed oil, but some of the other oils that are used in the making and use of oil paints. And then finally, I've got a couple slides from our factory just to show you how the paint is made today, from the mixing to the milling to the measuring of the quality. Then we're going to kind of switch gears into the use of the paint. And so we'll talk about some of the general working properties of oil. So those of you who are new to oils, maybe you've used acrylics before, so this will give you something to compare and contrast that experience. Next, painting with oils, just a real basic, what is it, or what does it mean to be painting with oils? What materials are needed? Again, more for the folks who are just getting started. Then I'm going to talk about fat over lean. I probably get asked this more than anything else. When that term comes up, people are like, what are you talking about, fat over lean? So I'm going to talk a little bit about it in real basic terms, hopefully to clear up that question if that's something that's been lingering for you. Then I'm going to focus the last part of the talk on auxiliaries. So auxiliaries are the mediums They're the oils, they're the solvents that we use as oil painters to adjust the working properties to meet our particular or individual goals as painters. And then finally, I've got a short little video that I'm pretty sure I'm hooked up to that will take us through reading the tube. So everything that's on the tube of Rembrandt paint, and this will carry over to other brands as well. Some of the things that are on our tube are common with other brands as well, like color index numbers. And this will be a fun little video, informative video to kind of show you what is on a tube of Rembrandt and what you would expect to find in any artist grade paint tube. And then finally, a giveaway. I got some goodies. So there's some goodies on the chair. There's tube bringers and tubes of paint. I kind of spaced them out, but based on the number of people here, I think everybody can probably walk out of here with a tube of paint and a tube bringer. So if the chair next to you has one or the other and you want to put those together, please take advantage of that. The quiz giveaway, I'm going to be giving off some sets. So I've got a 10-tube set and a 6-tube set. I have 2 of them, and I have a couple aprons, the Rembrandt aprons. So 6 questions in all for 6 lucky winners to walk out of here with some goodies. It's my bribe to pay attention. Often I'm speaking to classrooms, and I will go through this portion of the presentation. I can see people are just kind of sitting off in the corner, and then I say, giveaway. And all of a sudden, I get people sitting up straight in their chairs, and notebooks come out. And it's my great bribe to get buy-in. But it's always fun as well to give away some good stuff. All right, any questions before we get started? We're not a big group here. You know, if this was a full house, I would probably say hold your questions till the end just to make sure that I could get through and then answer everybody's questions. But I think we're probably small enough that we could get away with a question or two as we're going. So if something comes up that you really want to ask at that moment, feel free to raise your hand and I'll do my best to answer it at that time. Otherwise, go ahead and wait at the end and we'll definitely have a good 15 minutes or so or longer. 20 minutes or so to answer questions and have a discussion. All right? All right, oil painting. So a lot of folks think of oil painting as originating in the West during the Renaissance. And actually, we have discovered just recently, in 2001, that oil paintings predate the European tradition by a number of years. In the 7th century, actually. So in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban did a horrible thing and blew up these beautiful, iconic Buddhist sculptures that were carved out of the side of a mountain. So it was a horrible event. The flip side of that coin is that in doing so, they revealed a network of caves. And in those caves, as people got in there and were able to analyze these beautiful murals that depicted the life cycle of Buddha, they discovered that they were painted with oil paints. Binders that were made of a combination of poppy seed and oil, and intricately done and sophisticated done. Here's some examples of the cave itself, as well as a detail of one of the images. And so we're talking 7th century, many, many years before the European tradition began. And there's a lot of speculation as to why or how these exist. We were having a conversation before class briefly about it. At that time, at the 7th century, Afghanistan was a crossroads. There were many Buddhist pilgrims who were immigrating or migrating from India and China through Afghanistan. It was also the Silk Road. Much trade was going on. The rulers of Afghanistan at that time were a collective of tribes called the Kashan, who were actually very enthusiastic about supporting the arts and collecting art. And so they encouraged artisans to travel from all throughout the region. So there's a lot of factors that could have contributed to the subject matter that was depicted and the materials that used. It could have come from a tradition in India or China, or it could be that Indian or Chinese artists, when they got to Afghanistan, made use of local materials. Poppy seeds and walnut oil at that time would have been readily available. So there's a lot of speculation as to how these exist, but certainly it kind of blew out of the water this idea that oil painting began in the West. When we do get to the West, there were many leaps and bounds. So oil painting is thought to be something that began in the West during the Renaissance. It actually predates that. Oils were being used in the making of art as early as the 12th century, just not in the way that we are familiar with it today. Egg tempera was pretty much the popular binder, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But oils were used as a varnish over tempera. And eventually that led to adding pigment to the oils. There was a technique called guazzo, which was beginning a painting in tempera and finishing it in oil paints. So it wasn't just an instant door that opened and all of a sudden we were seeing these wonderful paintings. And you see the example of the painting here, 2 paintings by Van Eyck in this sophisticated form. It was a slow transition, but it was certainly at this period in the 15th century that we do see some revolutions. We see artists like Van Eyck discovering that they could polymerize the oil. Often they did it with the sun, but they would heat it up and that would change the oil's working properties. Turpentine also became readily available. It wasn't before. So now they had a solvent that wasn't available prior to this use that enabled them to alter the working properties. They started adding different types of resins into the oil that enabled them to create the wonderful glazes that we see. So there are many things that came together in the hands of these artists in Northern Europe that eventually led to these wonderful techniques that we call glazing today. I mentioned tempera. Prior to the oils, we of course have tempera and fresco, but they had limitations. They dried very quickly. You had to have a lot of your work pre-planned. You didn't have the ability to create the wonderful blends. You didn't have the ability, especially with the tempera, to have a wonderful tonal range that you could achieve with the oils. So there were a lot of restrictions and the oils opened up doors. And then of course we have the techniques that evolved. So techniques I mentioned were glazing. Oils tend to make pigments translucent. So they were able to create the wonderful layers of glazes that captured light and create the luminescence, and also to create a higher level of representation. And this was very important during this period of time. There was a real interest and passion for representing the world as we see it. Van Eyck is quoted several times of wanting to depict the beauty of nature as we see it and communicate the mythical or spiritual in the terms of the world around us. So meeting those philosophical needs, oil also played a role. So there was, again, many things that came together to make oil painting the dominant medium of the West. And another thing that doesn't get talked a lot about in art history classes is the paint tube. And it really was a revolution for different reasons. Prior to the tube, we had these wonderful things. Does anybody recognize what these are or familiar what this is? Pig bladders, very good. So these are pig bladders that are corked with a piece of wood. The most common way that an artist would store their paint, or they would sometimes get it like this from individuals called colormen. They would go to their colorman who would be grinding and making pigments, sometimes to order, and put it in these little pouches and bring it back to their studios. Not the most convenient method for the storing of paints or moving around, although they did. A lot of folks credit the invention of the tube with movements like Impressionism, and there's some truth in that, but not totally. There were certainly people who painted en plein air prior to the development of the tube, but it did make it much easier. But this gentleman in 1841, John Rand, came around and invented a lead tube. Thankfully, we're not using lead tubes any longer, but a lead tube that really did revolutionize, and I would say more appropriately, democratized oil painting. So not only did it make it more convenient for professional artists to work, certainly to acquire color, but it opened it up to a whole group of enthusiasts. So now anyone, not just professional artists, had access to these materials. And we see as a result of this tube, and this is one of the original tubes that he created, we see the result of a real passion for plein air painting of groups of enthusiasts who would travel out together and work to create painting as a hobby, not necessarily as a profession. It also spurred the modern manufacture of oil paints. So now you have this broader group of individuals who are interested in painting, and so now you have to make more paint. So art companies like Royal Talens in 1899 responded to that greater need and the ability to make paint in a tube. So there was really a pivotal change with the development of the tube of who was painting, how paint was made, and you would say also artists' relationships to their materials. Prior to the invention of the tube, artists had a much more intimate relationship with the materials, how they were made. Often they had to grind their own paint. Now they became distanced from that process, and that gap just grew wider over time. And I would say that it probably has not been closed very much since then. Artists don't have the relationship with the materials that they used to in that sense. So there's some positive things and maybe some not so positive things about it. I would say the quality of paint probably improved dramatically, especially in terms of consistency, when we started to see modern manufacture at the turn of the 19th century. All right, so what is the composition of an oil painting? So what goes into an oil painting? Of course, we have a surface, and the primary surfaces for oil painting today are either canvas or wood. Most people are working on canvas. There are others, though. Paper is becoming popular again. Paper has always been used for oil painting. Of course, you need to size it as well as you would with canvas or wood so that it's not corroded, but paper is a good surface for it. Copper is often used, copper plates. You might be familiar with Rembrandt's paintings. He has many small studies on copper paints, and they kind of add to the luminosity of it. And also stone. There's a wonderful painting by a Dutch painter named Bouts in the Getty, done on a litho stone. I can only imagine it's probably like 36 by 28 inches. It must weigh 150 pounds or more. But there are a lot of different surfaces that you can work on, but how you prepare them is really what's essential. And so the next ingredient to oil painting is the ground or the primer, and we're going to talk about some of those different elements here in a minute. The next, of course, is the paint, the combination of pigment with the oil binder. And then we have auxiliaries, which are the oils, the mediums, and the solvents that we use to work with. All right, so let's talk about the ground. What is a ground? So preparing your ground does several things for you in terms of making your painting or ensuring your painting will be successful and stand the test of time. First of all, it protects the support from the oil. Linseed oil is corrosive. It will rot through canvas and wood. So having a good ground is going to protect the surface from the oil itself. The next thing is it's going to provide a porous surface for the oil literally to get its hooks into. So oil needs to have something to grab onto. If the surface is too smooth or too glossy, it's going to resist adhesion. So you want to have good adhesion, so you need to have a good ground to provide that porous surface. And then finally, enables the paint to dry correctly. We often think, especially when we're talking about fat over lean, we're only focused on one side of the oil surface that is oxidizing, but it actually oxidizes from underneath as well. And having a good ground allows for that oxidation to occur both within as well as on the surface of the oil. So what are some of the different sizing? And here we have a couple examples. One is some preparation of rabbit skin glue that's being prepared, and the other is a traditional gesso. So let's talk about sizing first. So in traditional oil painting techniques, and this goes all the way back to the Italians, there was always a sizing that was applied. Typically it was an animal hide glue. Rabbit skin glue is still available today. And sizing would protect the surface, allow for adhesion, and also allowed for drying to happen. But primarily, it was there to protect the surface from the dangers of the oil itself to the canvas. So sizing was really important. And it had the added benefit of tightening up canvas too when we were using canvas. This is not the case with wood, of course, but it would tighten it up onto the stretcher bars and give us a better surface to work on in terms of its touch. And then we go to gesso. And traditional gessos were prepared not that different from paints themselves. They typically had an oil binder. They used white pigment, sometimes inexpensive fillers like calcium carbonate were used, marble dust was used. There are wonderful recipes that you can still access from Italian studios from the 15th and 16th century. I think it's Nino Cennini and his Il Librata is a book that you can still buy on Amazon and give you some actual formulas for making those early gessos. But they contained oil, so they required a sizing underneath them. Today, of course, we have acrylic gessos, and those are the dominant gesso that we use today, so sizing is no longer required, although I always recommend that you have at least 3 good coats of gesso on your canvas to prevent any uneven drying. And I can answer questions afterwards about preparing your ground some more. But just a little bit on the grounds here. Really important to get that preparation in. All right, pigments. So one of my favorite things to talk about, the coloring agents. This is in our factory, our manufacturing facility in the Netherlands. You can see these wonderful bags full of pigment, and this picture does not do them justice. When you are standing in front of them, I swear it's like light is emanating out from them. The reflective quality of these bags of pigment is so strong and so powerful. It's really wonderful to see in person. But pigments have a great story, a great history. We classify pigments typically by their origin. So we say pigments are either organic, coming from plants or animals. We say that they are inorganic if they are based in minerals. And then we say they are synthetic if we take that organic or inorganic material and synthesize it, cook it up, if you will. Heat it up, introduce other chemicals into the mix. Most modern pigments that we use today are synthetic versions, synthetic organic or synthetic inorganic. But there are still some of those traditional pigments that are in use today. And I'm going to share with you some examples of that. First, the organic pigment. So you can see in the inset picture this wonderful little Mediterranean sea snail. It's called a musex, not mucinex. I often say that by mistake, so I'm just going to spit it out there right away. It's not a decongestant. It is an actual name for this Mediterranean snail. Thousands of these were gathered up. The Phoenicians are credited with creating it first, and they would take the secretion from these sea snails to create Tyrian purple. It's also known as imperial purple. It was one of the first light-fast purples introduced, and it was incredibly sought after. It was very expensive to make, for one thing, but it also was highly valued because it was very light-fast, and it actually, as it matured, developed a patina that was really sought after and valued. The Romans called it imperial purple, and it was really something that was exclusive to the aristocracy, and it continued on for centuries. We see paintings and portraits of queens and kings and royalty often in purple, and that color is still associated with that symbolically as a result. In the background image, this is the shroud of Charlemagne from the 7th century, and it was dyed with Tyrian purple. And you can still see the marvelous color that we get even today from this natural organic pigment. You can see kind of the red around the edges, and that's the maturing. So the color goes from kind of this bluish purple to a reddish purple as it ages. Tyrian, the word, comes from a city that's still in Lebanon called Tyre, T-Y-R-E. All right, inorganic pigments. Inorganic pigments are those that come from minerals, so the rocks underneath our feet, essentially. They are some of the oldest pigments, so the oxides, ochres, red oxide. These colors have been around for centuries. Neolithic paintings that we have examples of. If you visit the caves in Spain or France, or Aboriginal work that's on rock formations in Australia, some of it 60,000 years old, most of them were made with inorganic pigments. This is probably one of the most famous in the West. And these stones, anybody recognize what these stones are? Lapis, yep, lapis lazuli. So the pigment then is ultramarine. The original ultramarine was a form of lapis ground up. Wonderful stories about lapis. Of course, the name itself, ultramarine, is a loose translation from beyond the sea or over the sea. And so the Venetian traders gave it that because it took its voyage from Afghanistan, where majority of lapis was mined and still is today. So the name comes from the great journey that it made. It was expensive then and still is today, very close to the same value as gold by weight. So it wasn't an inexpensive pigment to work with even then. So you had to be either a very successful artist or have a very wealthy patron to be using it. And it was even controlled by the Catholic Church at that time. What subject matter you could use on it, for example. You would see it maybe in images of Christ, or the cloak of the Madonna, if you will, was often in an ultramarine blue. And it wasn't for a century before those restrictions were lifted for many artists. You see Titian challenging it in some of his paintings, where he starts to use it in skies and in landscape elements in his paintings. But he was somebody who could do that, right? Not everybody could. And then finally, synthetic pigments. I mentioned that most of the pigments we use today are synthetic or synthesized. but that is not exclusive. Artists, like alchemists, have been experimenting with their materials for centuries. They are always looking for new ways to make color, to change the color or the working properties of the pigments that they have. And here I have probably one of the most famous synthetic colors, and that's lead white. Lead white was the most popular white during the Renaissance, all the way up into the 20th century, and there are many oil painters today who still value it and prize it over all other whites. The way that it was made was to take a coil, or one of the ways it was made was to take a coil of lead, to submerge that in a clay pot with vinegar, and pack cow dung around it to generate heat. And over time, the lead would oxidize and form the white crust you see in the image. And then that was flaked off, dried in the sun, and ground up into the wonderful pigment we know as lead white. So that's an example of a very old version of a synthetic pigment. Naples yellow is another very old example of a lead-based synthetic color. So synthetic colors have been with us for many, many centuries. All right, so let's switch gears to the other part of the paint. We have the pigments. Now let's talk about the binders. So the general, what is a binder? In general, binders are liquid substances that dry or harden through a physical process and create a paint film. That's true for almost all binders except for one, gum arabic, which is the binder for watercolor, does not create a discernible paint film. So what I like to talk about in terms of the primary functions of binders are suspension and adhesion. So all binders must suspend, and what I mean by that is pigments don't dissolve into the binder. Dyes dissolve, but pigments don't. Think of pigments like sand or pepper, if we're going to use a cooking metaphor. If you sprinkle sand or pepper into water, you can stir it up and they'll disperse, but eventually they'll sink down to the bottom, or with pepper, maybe it floats to the top. But they don't stay put, right? So a suspension or a binder needs to be able to hold those pigments in place once it's been mixed or stirred. So that idea of suspension is essential for a binder. The next part is adhesion. We're painting on a surface and we want it to stick. So it's got to be a good glue. And almost all binders have really excellent adhesive properties. Many were used more often as glue than they were as binders. Distemper is an example of that. Is anybody here familiar with distemper medium? Distemper was actually taking that rabbit skin glue and infusing it with pigment, using the rabbit skin glue as a binder and painting. And there are some great examples around the world, not a lot of them left, but there are some great examples of distemper paintings from some of these same periods that we were talking about earlier, the 15th and 16th century. But eventually, of course, oil became a much more popular and easier to use medium than distemper. But all binders are excellent adhesives. So suspension and adhesion, important part of a binder. I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to go through it again here, the working properties of every material are tied to the binder. So whatever the paint does, whether it dries fast or has a strong adhesive quality or makes a strong paint film, that's all related to the binder. Pigments are universal. We use the same pigments in watercolor that we use in oil painting. It's all about the difference in the binder that gives us this different behavior or characteristics. In oils, we use a group of binders referred to as the drying oils. And I'm going to categorize a few of those right now. And one thing I think you'll notice, and I'm going to go ahead and throw this out ahead of time, is they're all vegetable oils, the drying oils, but not all vegetable oils are drying oils. But an easy way to differentiate whether the oil you have in your kitchen can be used to paint with or not is where does it come from? Does it come from the plant or does it come from the seed? Oils that are expressed from the seeds most often are drying oils. Oils that come from other parts of the plant, like the fruit, like olive oil, are not drying oils. So that's just kind of a quick way to, when somebody says, wow, I wonder if I could use this oil to paint with, because I'm sure those questions come up. That's one way to make a quick decision on whether or not your oil is a drying oil or will be. So of course we have linseed oil. I mentioned it a couple times already. It's been the most popular binder since the Renaissance for over 500 years now. Linseed is from the seeds of the flax plant. You can see, you'll see in a minute, or actually you saw on the last slide, the pressing of linseed oil taking place. And a lot of people ask me, well, why don't we call it flaxseed oil? Why do we call it linseed oil? Anybody know the answer to that? No? So lin is actually the Old English, Old Norse for flax. So it's an old term for that very descriptive word. So the flax plant was called the lin plant at that time, and so that's where we get linen and linseed from that Old Norse term. So why is linseed so popular? Why was it important? It's the most durable of all of the drying oils, so it makes the strongest paint film. That's why we still use it today. And this is going to sound strange, but it is the fastest drying of all the drying oils. So that's relative, obviously. It's not a fast drying material at all, but it is faster than many other of the drying oils, and so that's why it's preferred. So its strength, its durability, and the drying time have made it the most popular. The only downside to linseed oil when you compare it to some of the other drying oils is it does yellow over time. And that really depends on the pigments that are mixed with it, and the type of mediums that you're using as well can increase or decrease that. Artists have used a variety of things to change that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today as well. One of the other drying oils, and this is more contemporary in its use, is safflower. Safflower is a type of thistle. You can see the flower of the safflower plant here in this picture. We use it today in manufacture of a lot of our whites or lighter colors, and there are some paints that use safflower even broader than that. Safflower does not make as strong of a paint film as linseed oil is, so often when it is used, it's used in combination with linseed oil to make sure that the durability is there. The best or the greatest benefit of safflower oil is that it's non-yellowing, and that's why it's used in those lighter colors or whites in particular. Next, we have walnut oil. Walnut oil was one of the first oils used in the West. I mentioned the use of walnut oil in that 7th century murals that we saw. Walnut oil is an excellent binder for oil paint. It's not quite as durable as linseed, but very close. There are certainly enough paintings at the Met done with walnut oil that have survived the test of time. So I think we can rest assured that it works well. It is non-yellowing, so that's a great benefit for walnut oil. There is one downside to walnut oil, and that is that it can go rancid in the bottle. You'll know if it happens because your studio will smell horrible. There's a corpse somewhere hiding in your studio. So there is a certain care and handling and storage of walnut oils that's required. Once it's on the painting surface and is oxidizing, you're not going to have a problem with it. It's when it's stored in the bottle that you have to take care. And then last one I'm going to discuss today is poppy seed oil. Another one I mentioned that was discovered in those caves in Afghanistan. Poppy seed oil is a lighter oil. It's used a lot today in the making of varnishes. It can be used to make paint. It's slower drying, even slower drying than safflower oil. So depending on the technique you want to use, it can be either a positive or a negative. I mentioned non-yellowing, right? So it's non-yellowing, and that's great. Its lightness, its non-yellowing features. It's used a lot in varnishes as a result successfully, but also on many mediums. A lot of people like to add poppy seed oil into their painting process to slow the drying down a little bit, and in lighter colors. All right, so quickly, how are paints made today? So here is where all the ingredients mix together. This is the granddaddy of all KitchenAid mixers, and we have several of them. And this is where the dry ingredients, the pigments, are mixed with the binder. And you can see a detail of it. And then I like this picture here because you get away from it and you kind of get a sense of the scale of these mixers that take place. So this is a typical batch of paint that's being mixed. And then it goes to the mill. Now I mentioned the mills when I showed that picture from the 1930s. And here's one of the mills today. And you can see some wonderful, luscious oil paint coming off the roller there. But this diagram I wanted to share with you because it kind of tells you how it functions. So we refer to these as triple roll mills. And the little red dots are the paint that came from the mixer and now is being poured into the mill. And what's in that mixture are what we refer to as pigment clusters. Now some student grade paints or economy paints don't even get milled. They just get mixed. And they'll use dyes rather than pigments, or they'll use transparent pigments that are dyed for color. And then those colors are just then sent to the tubing facility. Milling does something to the paint that makes the quality better. A lot of people focus on pigment loads, and that's certainly important, but milling is just as important. And the reason is this. One, is the reduction in size of the pigment particles themselves. So each time it goes through these rolls and it comes out the other end, it's put through again, and the rollers are put a little bit closer together. So the reduction of the size of the particles is happening, the breaking up of those pigment clusters. The other thing that's happening is the pigment is being more thoroughly dispersed through the binder. And that's really important when you talk about luminance and the ability for the pigment to reflect light back as we see it or perceive it. So that dispersion and the reduction of the pigment clusters is really important in creating an artist-grade paint. And the size of the particles gets checked along the way. And so there is still artisanship that's taking place in the manufacture of modern paints. So we have an individual who uses this tool. It's called a Hegman scale. And they put a swatch of the paint after it's gone through the mill a few times. And they eyeball it, and you can see him doing that here. On there are markings for what are measurements for microns. And what they're looking for is an ideal range of about 25 to 35 microns. And to give you a sense of scale or proportion, a red blood cell is about 5 microns in diameter, and a human hair is about 60 microns in diameter. So very, very finely ground. And what the scale does, it has a descending trough, and they put it through. And they look at that, and where they can see breaks in the paint film, literally where they can identify individual pigments, that's where they make the reading. And they do that by eye and experience. And then they send it to the lab to be measured by a microscope. And they are right 99.9% of the time. It's really amazing. I had the opportunity, again, I go to the Netherlands for training and to share ideas with folks. And we always make sure we take a trip through the manufacturing facility and to sit with these folks and be able to talk to them about the years that they've spent doing this and the pride they take in it is really, really fascinating. So wonderful craftsmanship that's taking place today in the making of paints. All right, so let's talk about some of the working properties of paint. So we've seen some of the history, we've seen what goes into it, we've seen how it's made. Now what do we experience as painters? So I think the thing that most people are aware of is the drying time, slow drying time. We refer to that with oil paints as oxidation, and this is really important in using oil, being aware of this process. Acrylic paints, watercolor paints evaporate. So they lose moisture into the atmosphere, and that's how they dry, and that's a very rapid chemical process. Oil paints go through what we refer to as oxidation. It's actually absorbing oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere, and that's a very slow chemical process. That's why it takes so long for oils to dry. Technically, it isn't drying at all. Oxidizing is a unique thing. Drying speaks more to evaporation, so it's probably more appropriate to say, it's taking my paint a long time to oxidize. So you can throw that one out in class next time. But it's very unique to oil paints and very important to understanding the processes of oil paints as we go along. Pigmentation. Oil paints have the benefit of being able to hold more pigment than any other paint. So there's more pigment, more color in oil paint than there is in acrylic paint or there is even in watercolor. The only material of color that has more pigment is a pastel, a soft pastel. Soft pastels have the most pigment, the most color possible. But oil paints are second and have the most of other types of paints. Pastels use a different couple, it depends on the manufacturer. Historically, gum arabic is a binder for soft pastel. Another gum or resin called gum tragicanth, fancy word for goatweed, is another binder. We use kaolin, which is a special kind of clay. It's the type of clay that's used in porcelain. It makes the Rembrandt soft pastels a little bit harder, but it's still pigment hungry, so it holds a lot of color. So there are different binders that are used depending on the manufacturer. Great question, thank you. All right, film flexibility. So this is really important to paint makers, whether you're making artist paints or whether you're making commercial paints, and that's the flexibility or ultimately the durability of the paint film. Oil paint has a fairly flexible paint film, but it can become brittle over time, and that's why ground preparation and surface is so important. As it ages, as it oxidizes or cures, it gets stiffer and doesn't want to be bent or moved. It's the myth that these thieves go into art galleries and cut paintings out and roll them up, and somehow the paintings aren't damaged when they take them back to their hideout and unroll them and have this fascinating painting. What actually happens is that when they roll them up and unroll them, they're covered with cracks and chips. Horrible examples. There's a documentary, if you're interested, about a Caravaggio painting that was stolen in Malta, and the thieves did exactly that and really destroyed that painting. So there's a brittleness to oil paint as it gets older, so the ground and the surface are really important if you're looking at the archivalness or long-term life of the painting. But a very durable film overall. Mass shift, what does that mean? So that means, does the paint change at all as it dries or oxidizes? Acrylics shrink. They evaporate, they're losing moisture, they're losing volume. Because oils oxidize, they don't. So that brush mark you make, that mark you make with a palette knife will stay exactly the same as it oxidizes, as it dries. And that's a benefit for a lot of oil painters. They want to see that brush stroke. They want to see the hand of the artist in the work. And that's really valuable. They don't want it to shrink away. There are things you can add to acrylics to stiffen them up, but then that takes away from the pigment ratio again, right? So oils have this benefit of not having or exhibiting mass shift. The next is color shift. Again, I'm going to pick on acrylics again, and I do this out of love because I use acrylics a lot. But acrylics also shift in color as they dry. Gouache is a villain for color shift as well. So what's happening with acrylics is the binder is milky white in its fluid form, and as it dries, it clears. And that means the pigment, the perception is it goes from light to dark. So we're taking that tint out. So all acrylics tend to look darker when they're dry. So the next day when you go to match that color and you go, wait a minute, that does not look like the same color on my brush, it's because it's not. It has shifted. Oil paints do not shift. The binder does not change. The translucency of the oil does not change during the oxidation process. So the color that you did 6 months ago on your painting, now dry, is going to be exactly the same as that wet paint on your brush. So it makes it easier to match colors as you're working on a painting over time. So no color shift with oils. Yeah. So there is yellowing to lighter colors, for sure. But it really depends on the pigment. So when you're talking about whites or light colors like Naples I mentioned, depending on the oil ratio to the paint, you can experience yellowing. But it's not universal. There are ways to work with your paint, either in a combination with solvents or with other drying oils, that you can reduce or eliminate the yellowing that takes place. But that yellowing is an example of potential color shift. But for the most part, when I'm talking to the working life of the painting, so that's how long you and I are working on the painting until it's finished, we're not going to see that color shift. It's really, you got to add a lot of oil into your paint, and maybe somebody else has a different experience here. But the oil content, if you're adding a lot of oil, doing glazing, the potential for it to yellow before you're finished is there for sure. But most people who are working with oils are not adding that much more oil into the painting process. It really depends on your technique. Yeah. So pigments are all living things, if you will. They have their own characteristics and lives and their own way of relating to the binder. On a chemistry level, we call it surface tension. So every pigment has a different surface tension, which means it has an ability or lack of ability to absorb the oil into it. And then to throw another wrench into it, as the paint rests after that initial absorption, it can expel some of the oil that it's absorbed. That's why often when you open up a tube of paint, there's extra oil on the top. That's actually not a bad thing. That means the pigment has expelled some of the oil that it didn't need over time, so it's matured in the tube. And because the tubes sit in the rack like this, the oil has been building at the top. You just squeeze that oil out or mix it back into the paint, whatever your preference is. But that surface tension of pigments and its relationship to the binder mean that some tubes of paint have a lot more oil in them and other tubes of paint have a lot more pigment in them. And because of that, we refer to paints in the tube themselves as being either fat or lean. And that means their potential to dull or sink can be affected by the oil content in the paint itself. The more oil content that's in the tube, if it's a fatter tube, less likely to shrink and more glossy it's going to appear out of the tube. Tubes of color that are very lean are going to tend to be more matte and are going to be more susceptible to sinking. So it's all about the surface tension of the individual pigments. And I don't believe there's like a reference sheet. Would be wonderful. Maybe I need to work on that. Which pigments do which? There are some references that you can find as you look for individual pigments, but I don't know of a chart that lists all pigments and whether or not they're fat or lean in relationship to oil. But there are some resources where you can investigate that. But that's often the culprit. So the way we offset that as artists, either to add oil to colors that tend to sink, or we can couch our paintings with oil before we start painting to create less absorption of the paints out. So those are just a few examples. Some artists like to squeeze their paint out onto a absorbent surface before using it to let it draw excess oil so that it makes all of their paint a little leaner, so they're working from the same level. So it all depends on whether you want to make your paint glossier or whether you want to make it more matte. Great question. All right, mixed media. Oil paint are great for mixed media. Acrylics definitely have a benefit there. They are a much stronger adhesive and relate more favorably to many more materials. You can throw everything but the kitchen sink. Well, you can throw everything in it but oil paint. Acrylics are really good adhesives. Oil paints are excellent adhesives as well. Anything that has an oil base in it can be used with oil paints. Any dry media like charcoal pastel can be used in combination with oil paint. So there are a lot of tools that you can use to create some wonderful mixed media results with your oil paint. All right, what do you need to paint with oils? What is it all about? There are actually very few things that you need to get started. You need the paint, of course. And there are many artists who just work with paint and maybe have some solvent on the side just to clean their brushes or some kind of essential oil like spike lavender or something like that. So you just need out of the tube. It depends on the brand and the philosophy of making paint. Rembrandt is often referred to as the direct painter's paint. Our manufacturing philosophy is to create a paint that can be used straight out of the tube without adding more medium or without adding solvent. There are paints that are very good paints. Somebody was mentioning Old Holland earlier today. A perfect example, those are paints with an incredible amount of pigment in them, but they're kind of like a Ferrari in the sense that you got to know how to drive a Ferrari to use Old Holland paint. You're not just going to be able to paint with it out of the tube per se. You're going to need to add some solvent. You're going to need to add some oil. So you're going to have some mastery over the medium to have successful results with that. Rembrandt is more like a Mercedes. You can just jump in it and drive. You know you got a good car, and it doesn't take a couple years on the circuit to learn how to shift gears. I love that analogy. I'm going to keep using that. For most painters, though, we have some type of solvent at least. And the most common is odorless spirits today, or white spirits. And we'll talk a little bit about the solvents as we go. But this is usually the bare minimum for painting with oil. So you got your oil paint and you got a solvent. You use your solvent to mix with your paint to change the consistency of it and to make it leaner, and we'll talk more about that. And then also you use it to clean up afterwards. Most people use this triad of materials when they're painting with oils. So you have your paint, you have a solvent, and you have the addition of another drying oil. This is a purified linseed oil. And so having that oil extends or expands the vocabulary that you're able to communicate using the oil paint. It loosens the paint up a little bit, makes it easier to brush into the surface, can create more transparencies, can change the sheen of the paint. So there are a lot of benefits to adding the oil into your process, even if you're painting alla prima. So here are the things that you need. So for those of you who are just getting started or maybe intimidated by all the mediums that you see on the shelf, those are great, and I encourage you to try them at some point, but this is all you need to get started. I mentioned alla prima, I've mentioned glazing and layering, and some of you maybe are familiar with those terms, others are not, so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about them. Alla prima literally means in the first in Italian. So it's typically a reference to making an oil painting all at once or in one sitting. Van Gogh is a perfect example of alla prima painting, typically making the painting in one afternoon while they were out, or maybe bringing it back into the studio and finishing up, but not an extensive months-on process of adding layers of paint. It's primarily what we refer to as a wet into wet technique. So because oil paints are oxidizing, they're very slow drying, I'm able in a single sitting to build up this paint, and the surface I'm always working into is a wet paint. So they're always wet into wet paint techniques. They can create some wonderful textures, and here's a detail of this painting that's at MoMA. Wonderful textures, impastos that he created, and alla prima is really, the wet into wet techniques used for it and known for it are really great for creating these kind of surface effects, because mostly you're working with that wonderful buttery consistency that the paint has right out of the tube. Glazing or layering is something totally different, and we were showing some examples earlier. Here's another one by Van Eyck. This is from the Ghent altarpiece. Really masters of the glazing technique, and really has not changed much. And many people still marvel at what they were able to achieve in their glazes, constantly analyzing how did they get these wonderful effects with the oil paints. So it's still being studied today. Layering and glazing is where you're literally waiting for each layer of paint to dry before you apply the next. Glazing refers to making those layers transparent. So you're creating luminosity by building up color through transparent layers. That's why those paintings that you see when you're in the museum have that wonderful glow. They're literally capturing light and reflecting it back through the color. And when you look at a detail of this particular painting, this is the jewel that was on the cloak, it's amazing that you see hardly any brush strokes when you compare that to the Van Gogh image next to it. You can pick a few of the details where the brush marks were made and some of the highlights, but in some of these jeweled areas, the glazing is perfected. It really creates the illusion of jeweled surfaces and metal surfaces as well as fabric surfaces. So really amazing what this glazing and layering technique is done. Something important in that is understanding fat over lean. And I mentioned I was going to talk about that a little bit. Are folks in here familiar with fat over lean to a certain extent? So I'm going to be brief, but I want to make sure I cover it for those of you who don't understand this, this context. When we're talking about fat over lean, what we're talking about is the oil content of the paint. We had a brief discussion that paint has a fat over lean quality right out of the tube. I'm going to focus on what we do to the paint afterwards in this example. So fat over lean literally is oil content, and there are two sides of this coin. So on the lean side, typically when we're referring to a lean layer of paint, we're talking about the tube of paint mixed with a solvent. Here's an example of the odorless white spirit. So whenever we add solvent to the paint, we're reducing the oil content or the ratio of oil in the mixture. In that case, we're making the paint leaner. The other side of that coin is when we add oil into the paint. So when we're adding linseed oil back into the paint, we're creating a mixture where the ratio of oil is higher, and that paint is referred to as being fatter. So lean paint, more solvent; fat paint, more oil. It's just like cooking. If you're adding more oil into the mix, you're making something that's fatter. It's the same thing with painting. Every time you add more oil, you're making paint fatter. So the question is then, why is this important? How does this apply to the layering or glazing techniques of Van Eyck or to any artist using today? And it has to do with how oil dries. So I mentioned oxidation, this absorption of oxygen. The more oil in the paint, the longer it takes for the paint to oxidize. And it's really important that that paint is allowed to absorb oxygen from the atmosphere. If you suffocate it or put another layer over it that dries more quickly, you prohibit that oxidation from taking place, and that's where you start to have problems with your paint film. You have this fat layer underneath and a lean layer on top. The lean layer dries more quickly, and that fat layer underneath is starving for oxygen and pushing and pulling, and that's where cracking and wrinkling can take place on the surface. So this is why it's really important that we paint fat over lean when we're layering. It's not as important when we're talking about alla prima or wet into wet techniques. Most painters who are working alla prima are not really paying attention to fat over lean because they're creating literally what is one layer of paint. Maybe they'll block in their composition or do their underpainting in a lean layer where they're mixing solvent with the paint and something that will dry fairly quickly that they can work into. But after that, they're not really paying attention to that. But if you're doing glazing or if you're doing layers of paint, subsequent layers of paint over time, this is really important to the strength and duration or durability of the paint film. So what does this look like? I wanted to come up with an illustration because it's one thing to hear it and it's another thing to take a look at it. So we're gonna bring up a quick diagram here. So here's the ground. So here's our surface that's been gessoed. Then we have our next layer, and this is a very simplified version of it. It can be much more complicated than this, but this is a very simplified version. So our first layer is our paint with solvent, right? So this is our leaner layer. Some people refer to this as the grisaille or the primatura. So it's our kind of a monochromatic image that goes down. At least this is the old master technique. So this is our lean layer. The next layer, and equivalent would be paint only, so we have no solvent. So now we have a higher ratio of paint. We haven't added any solvent to make the paint leaner. So that's our next layer, is paint only. Now we have paint with some medium added, but the paint is still greater than the ratio of medium. So we still are using more paint with just some medium. That's our next fat layer. So once we get past here, we're getting into the fat layers from the lean. And then the final example is where the medium exceeds the amount of paint. So we're actually adding just some paint to the medium to create those final transparent layers that go over for the finished painting. So this is a real simple diagram of what fat over lean looks like in practice. Any questions on that? Make sense? All right. Does that help for some folks who haven't been quite sure? Okay. Good deal. All right, so let's talk about all these extra things that you can throw into the paint to make it do all the different effects. I think we're still good on time. We're going to have plenty of time for questions and giveaways. I want to make sure I do the giveaways. All right, so what are some of the primary functions? Why would somebody want to add an auxiliary? If I can paint with just those three things, why use these other things? It's mainly to alter the working properties of the paint. So to make the paint do something different or make it do something very specific. Some reasons for using auxiliaries are to extend the paint. When I add linseed oil to the paint, I'm literally by volume creating more paint. So it's a great way to extend the paint that we're using. It can adapt the consistency. So I can take a thick paint and make it thin, or I can take a thin paint and make it thick. So that's another reason for adding an auxiliary. I can increase the transparency. Pigments can come, or paint can come in both transparent and opaque colors. If I want to make an opaque more transparent, I can add a medium to it. So I can change the opacity of the paint by adding a medium. Altering the drying time. This is very popular for contemporary painters. Many contemporary painters, although Van Eyck used secatives in his, that's a fancy word for a dryer, that went into the paint as well. But it's very popular today to add a medium that makes the paint oxidize more quickly so that we can build up layers more quickly. To change the finish quality. Some folks want their paintings to be matte. Some people want them to be glossy. We can add auxiliaries to make that happen. Change the quality or working properties of the pigments. And what are the types? So auxiliaries is a general term for oils. And we talked about one already, linseed oil. So oils can be used as auxiliaries to changing the working properties of paint. We have mediums, which are usually combinations of oils mixed with other types of resins or solvents. And then we have solvents themselves. Solvents are an important part, important auxiliary in using to make the paint lean, to change the finish quality, to change the consistency, a lot of different things we can use solvents for. And then I always like to caveat the use of these. Moderation is key, especially if you're just getting started. People can get into trouble really fast by adding way too much oil to their paint. So let's talk about some of these different oils first. So refined, bleached, boiled linseed oil. I'm going to show some pictures, and I actually have some flyers that you're welcome to that give a more in-depth description of the different properties associated with the materials or auxiliaries I'm going to talk about. I'm using the Talens mediums as an example, but these are true for mediums regardless of the brand. So I could easily be talking about Winsor Newton, I could be talking about Gamblin. It's universal language when we're talking about these auxiliaries, all right? All right, so refined, bleached, boiled linseed oil. Maybe you've seen these and wondered what the difference is. So real quickly, refined linseed oil is the most common. It's a oil that goes through a refining process using solvents to remove the impurities from it. Refined linseed oil is used to make paint. It's very easy to use to make paint. It's not the best thing to make your own paint with, but it can be used for that. Refined linseed oil adds gloss, it extends the paint, it makes the paint more fluid. I used it in the early examples. It really is the main oil that's used most commonly in the oil painting technique. Bleached shares a lot of the same working properties as refined linseed oil, except that it has been bleached to remove that yellowing quality. One of the results of the bleaching process, though, is that it makes the paint, or it makes the oil dry a little more quickly. So bleached linseed oil will remove the yellowing content. So if you're using a lot of lighter colors and want to add a lot of oil but don't want to have the yellowing, bleached linseed oil could be a good choice. But just keep in mind that it also will speed up the drying time or the oxidation. And then finally, the boiled linseed oil. Boiled linseed oil literally is boiled. It changes the consistency a little bit as well. It has all of those same effects that you get in the refined linseed oil, but the consistency is a little bit different. Both boiled linseed oil and bleached linseed oil have a slightly different texture and feel than the refined linseed oil. So it's going to make your paint more stiff than a traditional refined linseed oil will, depending on how you're using it with solvents. But those are the three that you'll run into most often. Cold pressed linseed oil is also commonly found today in stores for use. It's probably the most traditional. There's no heating process, as the term dictates. All the other oils go through some type of heating process in terms of their refinement. Cold press is just the press of the seeds. It's usually refined by letting sediment settle and then go through filters. So it's a filter type of cleansing rather than using a solvent to clean it out. It's probably the strongest of the oils. It's the best oil for making your own paint, if that's something that you'd like to do. It can be used in combinations with solvents as well, and it's less yellowing than some of the other oils like refined linseed oil. So it can be a really good medium as well. Stand oil is great for glazing. It's the traditional glazing. I mentioned early on in the talk about the polymerization of linseed oil by heating it. This is an extreme of that. They actually heat it at very high temperature for a very long time and starve it of oxygen at the same time, and it creates a consistency like honey. And what that does for folks who are glazing is it's very self-leveling, so all the brush strokes disappear. Just like you would imagine when you pour some honey on the counter and it slowly levels out everywhere except where it was supposed to, like off the edge of your toast. That's exactly what happens with stand oil. It can be very tricky to work with, though. It tends to wrinkle if you use too much of it. I've seen devastating results where portions of painting have actually slid off the surface. So you want to make sure you're not using more than 40% oil to paint ratio with stand oil typically. There are ways to change that by adding other resins to the paint. Natural resins, Damar is an example of a natural resin. Turpentine is a great mixture with with stand oil in combination with resins to combat that sliding or wrinkling that can occur with the stand oil. I mentioned already safflower, walnut, and poppy seed as binders. They also make excellent auxiliaries. They can reduce the yellowing in the paint when you add them. They can slow the drying time as well as increase the gloss of the paint and extend the overall paint. One thing that I really like about using oils, even in small amounts, is it just loosens the paint up a little bit. I think it makes the painting experience more enjoyable. It's much more rewarding to be able to push that color at ease and not have to fight it across the surface, especially if you're working with a very stiff, highly pigmented paint. So oils can really enhance the overall effect of painting with oils to a great degree. And here I mentioned this with the stand oil, but this is the recommendation by the manufacturer. Artists are never following my recommendations, but I'm going to throw it out there. And that is that 40% is usually the recommendation, not to exceed that. And that's to avoid those kind of accidents that I talked about, not just with stand oil, but there's also a risk of that with any oil, especially wrinkling of the surface. And you've probably seen that in paintings where there's these little wrinkles or dimples that can occur as the paint's drying. and that's usually the result of too much oil content in the paint. So that's something to keep in mind. There are ways to offset that. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to talk about that after class. After class, it's not class, after the talk. You can see where I spent most of my time. All right, so this is an example of one of the sheets. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it's up here for you to take if you'd like to take it with you. And it's just a kind of a quick cheat sheet that lists each of the ones that I talked about and all the different working properties on the side, and then you can kind of follow it over and you can see, oh, this one extends the paint. Oh, this one speeds up the drying time. Oh, this one doesn't do that. So just a nice cheat sheet that you can use as a reference when you're just trying to decide or determine if there's a medium that, or an oil that might be good for you. All right, so let's talk about the mediums. So painting mediums. So what's the difference between mediums and the oils? Usually they are a combination of an oil or a solvent, an oil, solvent, and a resin of some sort. So they're taking those materials that I mentioned at the beginning, that solvent and the oil, and they're pre-mixing them for you so that they're ready to use. Most painting mediums that are labeled painting medium specifically are a combination of a solvent like white spirit or odorless spirit and oil. Sometimes they're turpentine, so make sure you're watching out for that if that's a concern in your studio environment. But most painting mediums are just that, solvent and linseed oil. So kind of a pre-mixture that allows you to work with the paint without thinking about what ratio of oil and solvent that you need to create the effect you want. Next are glazing mediums. Glazing mediums share pretty much the same characteristics as painting mediums, although they almost always have some type of resin added. They tend to be a little thicker in their consistency and more self-leveling. They are made specifically for those glazing techniques that we talked about. So instead of trying to create your own glazing medium using stand oil and some resin and some solvent, you can get a glazing medium that has all those things pre-mixed, and you just need to add it to your paint to create that effect. Alkyd mediums. Alkyd mediums are very popular today. Alkyds, originally known as alcids, were invented by General Electric in the 1920s as coatings for electrical wires. It's a combination of a drying oil. Today we use soy as the base most often, and then they synthesize it or polymerize it with an acid and an alcohol, and it creates alkyd. It was huge in the commercial paint industry. Most house paints that you get at Home Depot and Lowe's or wherever you may be shopping for your house paint, those oil-based paints are typically alkyd paints. And the main benefit to alkyds is they dried much more quickly than traditional drying oils did. And that's the advantage of alkyd mediums today. There have been generations of alkyd-based paints. The challenge with that is alkyd does not hold as much pigment as drying oils. So the alkyd doesn't have the same color or vibrancy of traditional oil. And also today, with the prevalence of alkyd mediums, you don't really need to start with an alkyd paint. You can use and get the great color of a traditional oil paint and add some alkyd in it to create transparencies. Alkyds are also very popular with glazing techniques because they speed up that time of oxidation and allow you to build up those surfaces more rapidly. They are, because of their ingredients, often contain some solvents. They give off some pretty nasty, what we call VOCs. So always make sure when you're using alkyds that you have some good ventilation in your studio. That's true for any type of oil painting solvents, especially the paints themselves are very safe. A lot of folks are worried that there's something in the paint that's going to cause them harm. They're very safe. Certainly there are some pigments that take certain precautions in their use, but in terms of what you're breathing in, all the hazards for that are related to solvents, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Quick drying mediums are typically, again, that same painting medium base of an oil with the solvent, and then they add what's called a cicative, which is a type of metal salt typically that helps to speed up the oxidation of the paint. So these cicatives are very old in their origins. They were used by artists like Van Eyck and Van der Weyden, I think was the other painting I showed. So they have a long history of stability in the making of paint and the ability to speed up that drying time. So drying mediums or quick dry mediums typically have that additional cicative to speed up the oxidation. So it's usually the oil, a solvent, and the cicative. And then finally, dryers. So you can actually use those cicatives, those salts, directly into your paint. But it's a little more challenging because it's important to get the ratio right. Dryers like cobalt dryers and Japan dryers have to be used in very small percentages We have some direct siccative mediums available in our product lines too, and the ratio is like 2% and 5%, 2% and 10% with the deep. So very small amounts, and the reason for that is if you add too much, it compromises the integrity of the binder, the integrity of the linseed oil. So it's a little more complicated to use it. Where you can use the quick dry mediums or the alchemy mediums very liberally with your paint, dry mediums have to be used very sparingly. But they work wonderfully if you have a good handle on it and can use them successfully. It's just a lot easier to use the mediums because you don't have to be concerned about that ratio. And then finally, pastes and waxes. So painting pastes are usually some type of thickening agent added into the linseed oil and whipped up, if you will, to create a consistency that essentially is like a transparent paint or a paint without the pigment. Waxes are also very popular and have a long history of being used in combination with oils. Cold wax is a very popular medium today. It's a combination of wax and solvent together, and it adds body to the paint and makes the paint more matte. Matter of fact, paste and wax, when you compare them to all the other mediums on this, are one of the only ones that doesn't add gloss to the paint, or at least much less gloss. They tend, especially wax, tends to matte out the paint. And here again is another sheet that I have up here that goes through each of these and talks about their individual characteristics, and you're welcome to take that. And finally, we have solvents, and I'm going to talk about 3 today. Something about solvents, and this is, I think, important. Solvents are defined not necessarily by their intrinsic qualities, but more how they use them. So essentially, that means you could use an oil as a solvent. So a solvent or a solution is a solvent and a solute combined, right? One dissolves the other and creates the solution. In oil painting, solvents tend to turn to the ones that I'm going to talk about today. But there are alternatives to these, and I'll mention them briefly, and we can talk about them after the presentation as well. But I'm going to talk first about rectified turpentine. I mentioned earlier that it was something that became new in the hands of Renaissance artists and a vital tool. It's still used today. There are certain precautions that you have to take. It's not allowed a lot anymore in classroom environments or group environments. Used in small amounts in your studio with proper ventilation, it can still be safely handled. Although many people have sensitivities to turpentine, so that's something to be aware of. It is a toxic material. It will pretty much melt you from the inside out. I think it affects about every system in your body in a negative way if you're not using it properly. It can be absorbed through your skin. The worst part is breathing in the fumes. So moderation is important. When you look at the formulas of turpentine with oil painting historically, typically they were using very small containers of turpentine in very small amounts added to their paint and their painting process. They didn't have a coffee can half full of turpentine sitting out in their studio and then had 20 people in the studio with coffee cans full of turpentine and no windows. So it was very different when we got into these large paintings that we were all doing all together in our shared studio spaces and slowly killing each other with turpentine. So it was very different. So there are artists who still today will only use turpentine. There are certain resins that can only be dissolved by turpentine. I mentioned Damar earlier. So you have to use turpentine if you like to use Damar or want to use Damar in the mix. So it still serves a purpose. It's also very different than the others. Rectified turpentine is a distilled form of a tree resin. It comes from pine trees, essentially. And there are different types of pine trees and different names for turpentines. There's Venetian turpentine, for example, that's very popular in coating violins, but also with painters during the Renaissance. So it really gets their name, or they get their names from whatever their origin or species of tree that they're derived from. So they're a natural tree resin. And they also can have an oily consistency. A raw turpentine, or even some of the refined turpentines, if you've ever worked with them before, you can feel that in the surface, and you'll see it on the palette. It isn't like a white spirit or an Odo spirit in that character. It's a very different kind of creature. So I don't recommend it in communal spaces. I don't recommend using it without proper ventilation. You should probably have gloves if you're using it, especially if you tend to get paint all over yourself if you're painting. And certainly if you don't have proper ventilation in your studio, you want to stay away from turpentine. White mineral spirits is something that's more contemporary. It's a petroleum distillate. It has some excellent features. It's rapid in terms of its evaporation. So all solvents, as you're painting with them, they're evaporating back out. And they evaporate pretty quickly and just leave that linseed oil and pigment. White spirits tends to evaporate more rapidly, and it's preferred that way. It can be used as a thinner and a medium. It won't break down resins like turpentine does, so you can't use it to break down your own resins. You can certainly use it with mediums that have resins already broken down in them. You just can't dissolve them with white spirits. White spirits also is a volatile organic compound that gives off toxicity and requires ventilation. It's not quite as hazardous as turpentine, but still poses a health risk. So it's certainly important for ventilation with white spirits. Odorless mineral spirits, more commonly used today, most frequently found in studios, especially in studios where there's a large gathering of people. Odorless, there's good and bad to that. They still are harmful. The reason we call them odorless is what we've done is we've synthesized them to slow down that evaporation. Remember I mentioned how rapidly white spirits evaporate? So we've slowed down that evaporation process, which means it's giving off less toxicity in a short amount of time, but it is still giving it off. And over time that can build up. So you still should be making sure you have good ventilation even with odorless mineral spirits. There's still bad things that are coming from it, just much slower. And sometimes I think turpentine has a really strong smell. It's kind of like telling you, hey, I will kill you if you don't open a window. Odorless mineral spirits doesn't tell you that. You can be locked in a room and not get dizzy by the smell, and it can slowly be bad for you. So just because you can't smell it, and it isn't offensive and doesn't immediately start to attack you, doesn't mean that it isn't something that doesn't require ventilation. And then the question is always, well, are there any alternatives to these things? And yes, there absolutely are. Spike lavender oil is another type of oil, very similar actually to turpentine, but without the toxicity. You can use it in the same way that you use turpentine. It'll actually break down resins. So spike lavender oil is a non-toxic alternative to turpentine. Walnut oil is very popular today to use as a solvent. Remember I mentioned solvents are defined by their use, not necessarily their chemical makeup. Walnut oil is used to clean brushes. It's used to, in the painting medium, it's a little lighter in its feel, so it's a little leaner as a result. Still fat, but not as fat as, say, using stand oil or cold pressed linseed oil. So there are alternatives to these solvents. Also, there's water mixable oils today. I'm not going to talk about those at length, but the new chemistry with water mixable oils today is much improved from first generations. Essentially what they've done is taken a very old alchemy from tempera painting and casein painting and introduced an emulsifier into the oil. They've synthesized the oil, kind of like Van Eyck synthesized to polymerize his oil, only adding an emulsifier, and that emulsifier allows the oil to bond with water. So it's actually a very old tradition made new again and gives artists the ability to replace solvents with water. So if you are just can't use solvents for health reasons or other issues or concerns, water mixable oils can be a great alternative to still enjoy oil painting because they have all the same features. They're a true oil paint, and they have all the same working properties that you'd be looking for, just no solvents. All right, and I also have a sheet up here that talks about how you use the different solvents, but it also lists the hazards associated with them. So if that's a concern, you can kind of check it off, and you'll see turpentine gets a red X everywhere. And then white spirits not far behind it, and then odorless spirits, much lower risk in terms of health. All right, so this is the video. I'm going to run it, and I'm going to let it speak for itself. I might chime in. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Oh, you don't get to hear the jazzy, upbeat music with it, though, so I'll try to chime in here then. So the color codes are our proprietary color numbers. So these are the number systems that we use for our colors in every tube of Rembrandt paint, every tube of Royal Talens products. Matter of fact, these color numbers that are flashing before us, they are the same color numbers we use regardless of the paint. So it could be our acrylic paint by Amsterdam. The color numbers would be interchangeable, which can be really great if you're matching colors across mediums. The next symbol is we have little boxes here that tell you the opacity of the pigment. whether it's opaque, semi-opaque, semi-transparent, or completely transparent. This is how we test opacity in the laboratory. We have a machine that ensures the same amount of paint film is used each time, and then we can gauge the opacity using a spectro light fastness. So we use a plus symbol. Almost all of the Rembrandt colors are excellent light fast rating. That's 100+ years under museum light conditions. What you saw there was the chart where the colors go on are exposed to artificial light to gauge their fading. Here's the color index number. All manufacturers adhere, artist grade manufacturers adhere to the color index number. So we might call it ultramarine, somebody else might call it French ultramarine, and to find out whether it's the same color or not, you just flip that over and find the color index number. Proprietary names often have historic meaning from the country where the paint is manufactured, and so they don't always coincide, but color index numbers always do. And you can see the beginning of a color index number is always P, and then the first letter of the color. So PB is pigment blue, PY is pigment yellow, and so on. I love these pictures of the paint being made. And the tubing process. These videos are on YouTube, so if you look up Rembrandt tube, you can find this video, Rembrandt manufacturing. There's some videos also of the paint in production. And that was it. All right, so in conclusion, oil painting can be intimidating, but if you're willing to spend a little time and invest in some quality materials, it can be an experience that's accessible to everyone. It doesn't have to be something that's elusive. Now, its relationship with alchemy, I wrote down this little quote, I'm not sure about the mystery and magic, but I certainly believe in the transformational powers of oil and art in general, and that relationship between the two. So hopefully today there was some information that was helpful to you, new, or reinforced something that you already knew. Thank you everybody for your attention and for being here this evening.